You've been home for a couple of years now, buddy, but you're still fighting the war.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shoulder Untold Stories from a Forgotten War, a product of Grumpy Combat Media and Friends. At Shoulder to Shoulder, we share personal stories about the ways in which war affects us. I am Will Suber, one of the co-founders of Grumpy Combat Veteran and Friends Media. And I am happy to have my co-host back. She was gone. I was crying without her. KK, how are you doing today?
I am just so psyched to be back here to offer some sort of like structure to the program.
That's fine. I need all the structure I can get. So
it's the only role I have here.
That's not true. That's not true at all. That's not true. You actually ask the questions to make sure that I just don't start telling like war stories that three people like to hear about. So, hey, before we just start banding back and forth, let me introduce our guest who I actually met at the gym. Robert B. Miner. Bobby is as how he likes to be called. His nickname, is that right? Nickname?
Yeah, nickname, I think, right?
So Bobby was a West Point graduate, correct? And also did a deployment to Iraq. And now he is a writer and a dilettante, as it says on his website. I'm just reading his website, robertminer.com, whichever robertbminer.com. We'll put the website down on the in the show notes. Welcome to Shoulder, man. Really happy we're finally able to make this happen. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. Yeah, thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me, and excited to share my story.
Yeah, you know, we met at this like really like the nicest CrossFit gym I've ever been to in my life, and Bobby, what is like the guy at the gym that's like has the most weight, and then I'm the guy at the gym that looks like a lunatic. This is a disparity here, you know.
I thought you were going to say the guy at the gym who's crying a lot.
That too. That too.
I don't know why. That's the image that was in my head.
That's when I just did too many burpees. But yeah. But you know, we started talking, and I found out that, you know, not only I think, you know, he's a writer, just like kind of I try to be, but we also served in Iraq, and I think Diyala province together too, right?
Yeah, about the same time.
Well, hey, yeah, I know. Well, hey, brother, what we usually start to ask this from all of our guests who serve, but like, what made you want to serve?
Yeah, I think my story is probably a little bit different. You know, I grew up in Southern New York, was born in Manhattan, and we moved to the suburbs of the city when I was 6. It was one of those things where, you know, my parents, I think they were just unloading boxes, got sick of it, and decided to, you know, they wanted to take a quick trip. And so my childhood home is about an hour south of West Point. So they drove up the Hudson, and we, you know, went to West Point, kind of came in the gates. And at 6, my folks had already been, you know, reading me stories about King Arthur and Camelot. And, you know, again, at that age, when you kind of come to that place, I don't know if either of you have been, but I mean, it is a castle on the Hudson River. And, you know, that's what it felt like to me. And I truly, I know it sounds cliche, but I just fell in love with the place at 6. And so that was in my head all throughout my childhood, was, you know, to get there. You know, both my grandparents served briefly in World War II, but it certainly wasn't, I never knew my dad's dad. And it certainly wasn't a major part of my mother's father's personality or his history. You know, it just, at least before he passed, I never really got to know that side of him. So it wasn't so much, you know, this legacy that I was trying to fulfill. It was truly just, you know, I was not obsessed, but really heavily focused on all the values and just the kind of everything that West Point had to offer. So that was sort of my initial step. And then it turned out that as I got older, that West Point, you know, the things that they expect of their cadets, it was going to fit me. You know, I was a football player and a martial artist, and did well in school. And I just kind of was able to check those boxes. And so when it came time, you know, I didn't apply to Annapolis. I didn't apply to the Air Force Academy. Sorry, Will.
That's all right.
I didn't. I didn't. I don't know if maybe I would have, but I didn't really consider ROTC in my other as I was deciding on college choices. So it was going to be sort of. My sense is that it would have been West Point or a completely different path. But I decided on West Point. Um, as can happen there, I think obviously, there were some rough patches, especially in the first couple of years, but it turned out to be the right thing for me. And so that's how I ended up there.
Yeah.
That's so cute that you started at age 6 because
Yeah.
don't you expect that like when a kid is 6 and they pick a career path, you're like, well, that's going to change like a million times.
Yeah. I'm sure
And
I lurched from, firefighter to West Point to, Batman back to West Point. I don't know, but
it's
yeah.
all similar. Well, my
Right.
my bonus daughter is 13 and she is right now extremely oriented towards the Air Force. And I mean, she's planning her high school classes around it. Like she is very focused. And I keep thinking in my head, I'm like, is she going to change because she's only 13? But sounds like sometimes when you know, you know.
Mm-hmm.
For our listeners who aren't aware that, there's 3 main ways that people become officers, commissioned officers in any of the services, right? There is the service academies like West Point, Annapolis, Air Force Academy. And there's also like ROTC, Reserve Officer Training course, I think, or Corps, which is in most universities. And then there's also OTS, which you can enlist when you enlist and then you go straight to officer. But what he did was Bobby did is actually the toughest one because you have to do so much for these applications and you have to get a congressional endorsement. So if you could just maybe just explain a little bit what that entails for some of our listeners.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll caveat your statement. It's probably administratively, certainly the toughest one. I can't speak to how, physically or emotionally if, OCS or things like that are tougher, but yeah, so you start the process early in high school. I mean, I think it's spring or maybe even earlier of your junior year of high school. You really have to start your West Point application because it's a long process. It's a very involved process, and then separate even from the specific college application that you would do for one of the academies, you do an additional application process, several, because you have to cast a wide net in order to get your congressional recommendation. So. Whether it's your, representative of your district in the House, or you can apply to your state senators, you can apply to the vice president's office, but you do, in addition to getting accepted on your merits as an applicant to one of the academies, you have to get a recommendation from, somebody in Congress or a politician. So. Yeah, it's again a very involved process. A lot of interviews, a lot of paperwork. On top of obviously just performing academically, physically, extracurricularly, and so yeah, it's again a couple of years, and I was fortunate that it worked out well for me.
What is the difference between when you're going through like your actual training and then you enter service? Like how similar or different are those two experiences for people?
I think very different. Okay. Big Army versus West Point. Your focus is just different, and I think again, it's probably going to feel everybody's going to have a separate experience, but. While you're at school, certainly even, during the academic year, I mean, you are academically focused. There is a degree of some military training, you get drilling, you still exist in a cadet chain of command. So it is a military school, it's not, there are all those kind of restrictions and hoops, but, you're going to class a lot more than a regular college kid. And if you play a sport, you're doing that. And and then during the summers, you get a bit more of a taste of the military, so you can do your standard military schools. I went to air assault school going into my senior year. I can't recall. And you'll do you'll do training where you go off for a few weeks with an active duty unit and kind of get to shadow a lieutenant or platoon leader, and or do things where I went to Africa for a month and spent time with the French battalion of French Marines in Senegal. So nice. You get those broadening experiences, which is, pretty unbelievable, very, and unique, I think, to the service academies, to get that sort of, people go abroad and things like that, but have that sort of trust. I mean, that they essentially dropped me in Senegal and said,
Yeah.
figure it out. Obviously there was support, but so yeah. And then I think, you graduate, you commission, and you're still training, right? And you sort of get a bridge to the regular army, to the big army. So, it's probably changed in the 15 years since I went through, the officer basic courses, but you start out with a group of, other lieutenants from different branches, and then you get more specialized into your branch, a few weeks of training to a few months of training, and then, whatever follow-on schools, ranger school, or whatever the case you might need for your particular unit. And then you wind up at your unit. So there is still, even from your commissioning date, you've still got months to sort of get yourself up to speed. And then, then you get to your unit, and then there's, inevitably a bit of shock. I was one of the guys you hear about whenever, at every stage of your development as an officer, or as a cadet, where, I showed up I was in the 25th Infantry Division, 214 Cav, as my first duty station out of Hawaii. So that was very fortunate. But so we showed up.
Hardship tour.
I showed up. Yeah, hardship tour, exactly. Well, and then, the funny thing there, right? I show up, and then 3 months later we deployed. So I got a taste. I got a taste of Hawaii, and quite literally, I was on staff for those 3 months, and quite literally, we were in Kuwait, and the day before we left Kuwait to go to Iraq, I got my platoon. So, what everybody tells you is going to happen, and then, and that it's exactly what happened to me. Which it turned out to be the absolute best thing that could. I got a full year of platoon leader duty deployed, which is exactly what I wanted. Maybe it would have been nice to have a little bit of training time on the front end with the guys, but I had, unbelievable NCOs and soldiers, and again, took the advice that was given to me, which was, you're not the boss right away. You might say so on your chest, but you're not. Sit back, listen, learn, take the reins slowly, kind of, string by string. And then, once you feel it, once you're certain that you're ready for it, is when you can dive in.
So your first foreign deployment was to Kuwait?
That was the staging area into Iraq. Yeah. Okay, so, went there, qualified with weapons, did that sort of stuff, got acclimated, and then you go from there into Diyala.
As a civilian, I'm always really interested in when your first deployment is something of like that, I think, importance, or, in that kind of a location. Did you go into that feeling prepared to be there? Or did you, in your first couple of weeks, were you like, I am not prepared to be here at all? Like, what was that experience like?
It's a good question. My sense is that I did feel prepared. Okay. Again, I wasn't overconfident. And because of that, I remember specifically one thing, right? So, I mentioned it was kind of drilled into us, you do need to, you will be de facto the jury in charge once you get there. You are the highest ranking member of your platoon.
Okay.
But your platoon sergeant has 15 years of experience to your 15 months. So it is very important to rely on those, him and the rest of your senior NCOs, especially because, it's my first deployment. I had one guy that was his sixth, and he wasn't even the most senior guy in the platoon. So you do have to begin immediately in some ways to kind of assert your position as the leader. But in other ways, you do need to kind of watch and learn and listen. So there was for a while, my platoon sergeant, for the first couple of weeks, my platoon sergeant would call back to the CP when we left the base for missions. He was kind of the main guy on the radio for a couple of weeks. And that was something that we just kind of, I don't even know if we had a conversation about it, but there came a time a few weeks in, basically before we left on mission, we did a ramp briefing, and then we got onto the trucks to get ready to go. And he was like, okay, sir, this one's you. And so, and that was when I took the reins there. And so, there's a balance to be struck, I think, between exerting the talent, for lack of a better term, and your training and your intelligence, whatever other talents you might have as an officer that puts you in that position, with trying to overlay that with the practical realities on the ground. And that just takes a little bit of time, and it's going to be a little bit different for everybody. I felt prepared, but not so, overconfident that I wanted to come in and steamroll my guys or decide that my way was going to be the way that we were going to do it. They'd been together for months before I got there. They had tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs in place. They had a rhythm, and it would not have been a good leadership decision, in my opinion, to come in and disrupt that. So, I think I took the right tact when I came in, and that has to do, I think, with feeling prepared or confident enough to be patient in that way.
That's a good point.
Let me just talk about a couple of the acronyms we pulled out there for my listeners, right? Like CP command post, NCOs. He had great NCOs, non-commissioned officers, who are usually, E6, which just means they've been in there probably 5 years, depending on who they are. So that's who usually what you'll see is young lieutenants like Bobby was, is the ones who succeed kind of sit back and listen to what the NCOs, or especially the senior NCOs, like the platoon sergeant, will mentor him. Because behind every bad commander, there are a history of NCOs that either tried to tell him that he was all jacked up and he didn't listen, or they didn't tell him and he just thought he was amazing. It's one of those two usually. And so those first weeks and months, what Bobby's talking about is, I was never a platoon leader, but I went out a lot with Army guys as a humantor, and I was lucky enough just to tag along with them. But young platoon leaders, I mean, that's when you find out a lot about yourself. From while I was watching them try to be in charge of all these very experienced young men, mostly, and that who have multiple combat deployments, and you are brand new. And I tell you what, it feels like it. It felt like it to me in 2006 when I went on my first deployment. I was scared out of my mind, and the thing that I was most worried about, that I was going to make a fool out of myself. And I think that I promise you, the first time I went outside the wire, I almost forgot how to clear my weapon. I was like, what am I doing? I was like, wait.
Can you explain to people what clear the wire is?
Huh? Oh, once we go outside the base, yeah. It's a thing when we're very young and going out. But so you were in Diyala, right? And that is 2012, Bobby, is that right?
2010 to 2011, I was deployed. Yeah, okay. June to June.
So could you so you were an infantry platoon leader in Diyala?
Is that cavalry scout? Yeah,
cavalry scouts. Thank you, cavalry scout in Diyala. What was that like? What was your thoughts going through your head when you landed in Iraq, or when you finally went from Kuwait to Iraq? What was that like for you?
I mean, it's so much stimulation, and most of that's internal, right? I mean, just the heaviness of the moment, getting off that helicopter and crunching across the gravel, and just knowing you are where you are, and you've arrived at the place that has been, depending on, if you want to go all the way back to my story about being 6, right? Like it's 15 years in the making, right?
Yeah.
And now I'm here. So there are nerves, and it's funny while you say that, it's like, the half of your anxiety about it is not there's going to come, mortar round going to come down and blow you up. It's, am I going to look stupid getting off this bird, or, the way I carry my rifle or whatever.
That makes sense though, because those are the things that you can control.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a heaviness to it. Obviously I had the added weight of, again, I mean, I literally had met my guys the day before.
That's brutal, bro.
So there's just a ton of uncertainty, and the best thing that you could do, I think the thing that I did was, I mean, to your point, you focus on the things that you control, and you look at to use a military metaphor, you focus on the 50-meter targets first. That's a range thing, right? You shoot, when you're qualifying your weapon, you shoot from 50 meters to 300. And obviously the 50-meter targets are easier to hit, right? So you focus on those. But yeah, I mean, it was certainly a heavy moment. I think the nerves dissipated quickly for me. I was nervous the first time we went out the wire, but after that, there's just too much else going on. I think to unless you have truly bad anxiety, there's enough happening to where it keeps you very, very present. War is good that way. It's hard to for your brain to make up other stuff to worry about because there's plenty right in front of you to worry about. It's only when you get back that it starts to betray you again. So yeah, I mean, I think that's where my head was at in those early days.
One of the things that like civilians always hear about military life is how much of it is based on like an inherent trust in the person who is next to you. Do you like, is that true? Like when you walk into a situation, like it's one of your first deployments and you're really young and you're in a place like Iraq and you've just met these people, like, is there a part of you that's like, I just have to trust the people who I'm serving with? Or is there another part of you that's like, also, but I need to like put in the effort to sort of like figure out how we function as a team? Like what's that balance like?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both. I mean, inevitably you hit the ground running, right? I mean, we were fortunate enough to be able to do sort of a 1 or 2 week transfer with the outgoing unit. So we didn't have to take over the sector immediately entirely by ourselves. So I did have the opportunity to get to know my guys a little bit before we were, on our own essentially. But still you do, there are heuristics that you have to use in order to function, especially when you're in my situation, when you were, in a situation like mine. Guys wear rank for a reason. Obviously there are different, levels of quality among every sergeant, staff sergeant, sergeant first class, down to private, whatever. But there is a baseline standard of quality that you would hope that everybody can achieve. And so, you can rely at least on that. And, there are things like, and it's the reason why as an officer, for instance, right? Like you don't want to be a slob. It's tough to not look the part because again, what else do your guys have to go on in those early days? So they know if you can take care of your body, if you can do X, Y, and Z, if you can shoot well, if you communicate well, if you can stand up in front of them, with your shoulders back and tell them what's going to happen, they at least have that to go on. And then, as time goes on, they can learn more about you and that trust deepens. But, yeah. And that goes both ways, right? So if I, look at my platoon sergeant, my senior scout, all the way down to my squad leaders and my driver, you do it every day. You look around, you go to the grocery store and you say, this guy makes me nervous, or this woman has themselves, she handles her kids well. I'm not, I'll get into this grocery store line behind her, whatever the case is. And then again, as those relationships deepen, the trust deepens. And again, it's a process and it happens. None of it happens in a vacuum, and you have to, move through those processes, they have to be congruent. They have to, they have to happen simultaneously because that's just the nature of war. You're operating and you're you're growing your unit at the same time.
For our listeners, where Bobby was at in Diyala is kind of near Iran. The Iraq-Iran border has a border. It has a lot of Kurds, a lot of Sunnis, a lot of Shias. So it's an interesting place because I went to the same place about a year afterwards, and it's a little microcosm of Iraq because of the way the ethnicities are kind of laid out and the tribal dynamics. As you're a platoon leader, you've never been to Iraq before. How was that like trying to interact with local nationals? Like, that can be so difficult. It's, a lot of it depends on linguistic support. And sometimes you get like sometimes you get a great interpreter and sometimes not. That happens. And, I just wonder, like, how was that experience for you? and how hard is it to try to understand the culture that you're basically immersed in?
I think it is. So you're absolutely right about the linguistic support. I mean, we're really fortunate to have, I thought, I mean, I couldn't have asked for better interpreters, translators. All our guys spoke Kurdish and Arabic, obviously, in addition to English. So that was hugely helpful because we were operating almost all of the time with both Iraqi army, which speak Arabic, and the Kurdish Peshmerga, who speak Kurdish. Not to mention the Iraqi police and all the sort of non-security force entities that we did interact with. So that was huge. Just having them available and the quality of those guys, that was big. Culturally, there's nuance to it. There's, again, I don't think anybody, certainly nobody in this part of the world, can really understand what it's like to grow up in a culture with such deep-seated rivalries, and that's probably a bad word, but to have those sort of cultural, ethnic, religious lines drawn so starkly, from your upbringing, from your birth throughout your life, regardless of the sort of divisions that we might see in our country at certain times in history today or yesterday, whatever. It's just not the same. And I think you can know that and respect that, and have it influence your decision making without, and also know at the same time that you're never going to understand it.
Yeah,
you can know that those divisions exist, and know that you're never really going to know what it feels like. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years of those things being ingrained culturally. It's just, yeah. I mean, it's difficult for a 250-year-old nation to fathom, right?
Sure, absolutely. Especially such a future-oriented culture that we're in. We have
yes,
a propensity
exactly.
to be, individualistic. The idea that it's, whatever you are is great, and what you can be is who you are to achieve. Like what I tell my daughter, like that there's just different type of cultural emphasis on the family and on the individual that you will have in Iraq and Muslim cultures and some in South Asia as well. It's just, when I was a young lieutenant, I was just like, big eyes, like this big. And I was like, oh my goodness gracious, I have no idea what I'm doing. I hope I don't screw this up.
Yeah. I think the army, the military, the structure that it gives you, the framework that it gives you to operate is beneficial in that case, right? Because you just have a mission, right? And now, strategically, at the highest level, the political level, you could argue, well, is the platoon leader's mission nested in the correct, strategic mission? That's those were, above my questions were above my pay grade at the time, but I knew what the mission was. And even if I thought, well, okay, it was just easy to put one foot in front of the other. Obviously, there were moments of frustration. I remember specifically a conversation with a Kurdish platoon leader. It was night. We were all living together on this checkpoint out in the sort of in the middle of nowhere. IA, Pesh, and my guys. And I remember having a conversation with him one night. And basically the tenor of it was, yeah, once you guys leave, it's going to be bad again. That essentially there's this détente, but and you might even be able to make progress. You build a water pumping station, or you supply a school, you do these things. Those are inherent goods, right? To the community, to the security of Iraq. But these ethnic and cultural divides are not going away. Just because, so there were frustrating moments for sure. But again, you focus on the 50-meter target when you're there, and, keeping your guys safe and doing the best you can to create some level of lasting impact, even if it's small.
We've talked a little bit about like some of the challenges of your deployment, like, getting to know the people that you're serving with and trying to understand like some of the cultural nuances. What's one moment from this deployment that has always stuck with you? And like, how has it influenced who you are as a person now?
One moment. Um, that's tough. I mean, I think so. I'll say, as I try and find one in my memory, I'll say it was. I always say that being a platoon leader like on a deployment was the best job I will ever have. A Will quoted from my website, called me a dilettante. And I wrote that because after I got out of the Army, I got out of the Army about 5.5 years, thought about staying in, I went to the captain's career course, which is a prerequisite for company command. And I decided to get out. And then I did sales. I met my wife and moved out of New York, and then did like construction management and then real estate and all these things. And I just couldn't, until I found writing, I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do.
Mm.
And it's tough because being a PL, being a platoon leader on deployment, set that bar so high. It's the best job I'll ever have. Even, the further I get away from that moment in my life that where I was a leader in that very intimate and specific way, I don't think I will ever lose the perspectives and the values that made me good at it. Because they became so ingrained in me throughout that year. It's tough for me to think of a single moment that changed me.
Yeah. Well, the whole experience changes you, right? I mean, like, is it that one moment where you got shot at, or is it just the moment where you realized maybe that things weren't going to go the way you wanted? I think all those things changes you. All those minor things that you experience on your first push, it changes you. Just for my listeners, a couple of things real quick. IA is Iraqi Army, and Pesh is Peshmerga. Where Bobby was at was in this kind of area in northern Iraq, called it the DIBs, the Disputed Internal Boundaries. And it was basically part of Iraq is divided between Kurdish regional government and the Iraqi government. And there was a lot of tension there. And that's what he was kind of stuck in, and it's very hard to navigate those type of areas. But one of the things that that I really loved in your answer is what you said is the best job I've ever had. And I would say the same thing when I was doing village stability operations in Kandahar. I actually remember thinking to myself at one point, I don't think I'll ever do anything in my life as good as I'm doing this right now. I'll never be as good as I am right here, right now in my life. And
yeah,
I tell you, it's hard to walk away from when 4 years, 20 years, and then you walk away, and now you bounce around trying to figure out what's next. Like, and then you finally come to writing. So like the writing what is it about the writing that called to you? I mean, what was it?
I think every former soldier, has to work to make sense of their service. And I think, it doesn't matter where you land on the political spectrum or what your rank was when you were in. Everybody reckons with it to some degree. I struggled mostly with not feeling like I did enough, and which is ironic for somebody who decided to get out at 5. But to jump back to a point you were making, Will, right? Like, being a platoon leader was the best job I'll ever have, right? But when I looked at a 20-year career, and this was the main driver of my decision to get out, if I did 1 or 2 company commands or troop commands, and then I got a battalion command, that's still 6 years out of 20 in charge of line troops, in charge of, line soldiers. The rest of that time is staff. And I just wasn't willing to make those sacrifices. I didn't think I was going to be a very good staff officer because I wasn't going to be enthusiastic about it. And I was good at being in charge of, soldiers. But anyway, so that was my calculus. But still, so despite that, making that choice, I had buddies that died, obviously classmates from West Point and people that I knew, and then subsequently soldiers. Um, and it's tough for somebody who had talent for it to look around and kind of. I had a pretty quiet deployment, certainly relative to some of my friends, even friends in my own division or brigade, when we were deployed. So a lot of what I was trying to figure out was, okay, well, what does it mean then to me? What are these years, the years preparing for it at West Point, the years that I spent, in the Army, the year that I spent deployed, what does it mean both to me, both, to the country? And so it took me a long time to figure out. If you look at my website now, the first 10 or 15 stories that I wrote, maybe there's one military story.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to figure out how to write effectively about my experiences. Now it's starting to happen. Now, obviously I've gotten better as well.
I mean, when I look at your
at
your website, like, and everybody should go look at it. RobertBMiner.com. Go read his stuff. I really like The Hammer, although it's not on that one. It's on jjournal.org. But like, it takes a while to find your voice. For me, Bobby, for me, like I spent a long time trying to like write academic stuff, trying to make it in these journals and stuff like that. And then I just realized for me how much I hated it. And I just wanted to, I hated it. I'm like, great, another citation. Yeah. Wonderful. Right. A bid. And then, you're like, I just put in my whole life into this thing. And then I'd like go look and see how many people read it. And it's like me and my mama. And I was like, well, I got to do something better than this. And how did you find your voice? How does that work? Like, how did you kind of get to that point where now you're writing about the war?
It certainly took me a while. I had to, kind of to your point, I had to stop trying to sound like something. I had to be honest about the way I spoke and the sorts of stories that I was going to be writing. And, whether it's, my military experience, my civilian experience, or my whatever, all of that feeds into your voice. And so, yeah, it just took me, I failed a lot, I think is the short answer. I racked up a ton of rejections.
Oh, yeah.
And that was even a good, kind of mental shift for me, as I realized, okay, well, that's what I have to do. I have to get a bunch of no's because that's what it takes to get the yes. And so, again, it's a very, if I didn't love to write, if I didn't love the process, obviously, nobody does it if they don't love it, because there is so much rejection, no matter how good or successful you get to a certain level.
That's why you should start your own website, Bobby. That's what we did.
Yeah,
that's right. We're like, what do you mean? Yeah. No, we'll show
screw the system.
Yeah. Hey, that's the beauty of the culture we live in today, right? You can create your own platform now. The question, and for me, obviously there's a way to do that. There would be a way for me to do that. I could create a Substack or do whatever the case is. And, but again, for me, this is sort of exorcism, with an O. I am working through these ideas. And I think there's a really interesting statistic that, sort of clarifies my perspective on this, which is, veterans who did not deploy are about 50% more likely to commit suicide than veterans that did. And so there's this thing that happens where, and I'm no psychologist, I don't pretend to have any kind of medical or intellectual insight. All I can talk about is sort of my own experience and work through that. But that sort of feeling of shortfall for me was difficult, because these were some of my best friends, the guys, special forces officers, guys that went to Ranger Regiment, guys that had done, a couple more deployments and, been shot at more times than they could count. And if it had been 10 years ago, standing in the room wouldn't have mattered. But now that we'd had these experiences and these different experiences, I think it became, and this has nothing to do with them, but it became difficult for me to sit there and speak. I didn't feel like I had a voice to give to any of these conversations when we were talking about our service. So that was sort of what I was trying to work through. I was trying to give meaning to these interesting moments, whether it was something as small as, watching a scorpion and a camel spider fight it out in a little blue bucket filled with sand, or, the little janky pressure plate IED that we encountered, or, spending time at the Iranian border. I was trying to figure out what these moments meant. And it took me a lot of writing, a lot of bad writing, and a lot of stories that went nowhere to figure out how to begin to reconcile the meaning of my service. And I think that's what a lot of guys could find value in art, during or after their service, is just to kind of experiment with that. It doesn't even need to be on the page. It can be through, visual art. It could be through anything. But I think anybody who's, feels a little uneasy about moments of their lives, giving thought to it and turning it into something has a ton of value.
Yeah.
Well, you're talking about trying to figure out like what the value of your military service was. And I'm curious what you would say the answer is at this point. Like now that you've gone through the writing and you've thought about it, like if somebody asked you to say what was the meaning of your specific service, what would you say?
I don't know that I have an answer yet.
Fair.
I think good literature asks more questions than it answers. And I think that I have begun to, I can speak to what it meant to me better now.
Okay.
Obviously, I've been doing that. I feel much more comfortable talking about it, especially even to a guy like Will, who's been deployed, 6 times and continues to go overseas and do that sort of stuff. I can sit here and talk sort of without embarrassment about the things that I did. And obviously it has, I'm not who I am without that experience. I feel like I live a more values-based life than most people. That has a lot to do with, my time at West Point, my time in the Army. I still feel strong and capable, and I'm not afraid to walk down a dark alley at night, when I'm with my wife and kids, and that has a lot to do with it. I don't know what my impact on the world was. I know what the intent was. And I think, again, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think history will not look positively on them. But I can say with certainty that my intent to serve was a uniform good. And I think I can say that almost, with 100% accuracy, that anybody who signed their name to that blank check, they should feel proud of that moment in their lives, regardless of what they ended up, doing with that time.
Amen, man. Yeah, I think, one of the things you hear a lot from people like in service of veterans, even in active duty, is like, well, this other guy, he did more than me and all this stuff. And it's like, who is that one person that like gets to say that nobody ever did more than me? Maybe it's the guy that killed bin Laden or Audie Murphy. I don't know. Because, you never find that man, right? And that is a universal thing, right? I mean, it's just, I was thinking on my flight here, I had a conversation with an Israeli soldier when I was in the IDF, or I was up in Israel, and he was a young man, and I wrote about it, and he asked me why he didn't like being if I liked it when people called me hero, and because his friends were calling him one. And I told him at that point in time, I said, no, I don't like it, but you're going to have to learn to get used to it because people are going to call you that. And I think about that when people talk about like there's a guy that did more than me. And I was thinking about that today. And I think it's important that we talk about that because the reason, at least my understanding of it from me, I think one of the reasons why people are afraid to say that or be admitted to it, other than just being, just being polite and being brought up in a certain way, is that they're afraid that something is going to get brought up in their past, that they did something wrong, and that they're going to be held to a standard that's impossible to be. Like, you can't be the hero that you think I should be, right? But I have done heroic stuff, but I can never meet that threshold of what you expect of me. And I hear a lot of that, when I talk to veterans, that like they don't want to be that congratulated because they're fearful that somebody else, that they may think that they're trying to get something out of this other than like having the honor to serve next to it. I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit, but I just kind of sparked something in my mind.
No, I think you're right in a lot of respects. I think it's you run into a lot of problems anytime you label something, right? Because you put a boundary on it, by virtue of the definition of whatever word you choose. And sometimes you don't feel like you fit the definition of that word, whether or not somebody feels, like it's an appropriate one to use. So I think there's that. I think too, there's this sort of logical fallacy that happens where, if you've made it through, you survived whatever you've been through, all of a sudden in your own mind, it becomes less than what it was. That experience becomes less than what it was. I got through it. How could I possibly have been a hero or whatever the case? And again, that's a fallacy, right? Like it doesn't change just because you survived, just because, you still rose to a moment. And it doesn't change the material facts of what were or what was in that moment. But I think that's a difficult thing to, we always diminish the stuff that we've been through, whether it's, regardless, I think of what that is, because we accomplished it. Can't have been that hard, right? But that's never truly the case. But yeah, so I think that's a pretty ubiquitous perspective among guys, and again, because I think most people sign up, most soldiers get into this for the right reasons. I knew very few, if any, guys that were excited about deploying so that they could shoot up something or other. Everybody was there because they believed in something. Some were there because they needed to be there. They didn't have a lot of other options. But again, Kate, you mentioned this, right? Once you get on the ground, it becomes more about trust and the bonds that you form and, the things that you're accomplishing. And there's not much room for anything else until you get home, and then it gets complicated. And, here we are talking about it.
Well, I think too that like some of the characteristics that draw people into military service are the very same things that can cause a lot of like challenges once you're in, right? Because people who are in the military have a reputation as it's about integrity, and it's about, like commitment and dedication and values. And that's what drives a lot of people to want to be in the military. And then once you're there and those expectations, those can feel really crushing because we're just still human. And so you find yourselves in these situations where you feel like you need to perform at a level that maybe isn't even realistic, especially given like where you are. And I think that's part of what you're speaking to when you say a lot of people need to find their value in their service. It's like, how did I fulfill those things that first drew me to it?
I think the good thing about the military is that, people wash out, but for the most part, even if, guys struggle to reach a certain standard of behavior or performance, typically they get lifted to that standard. That's the beautiful thing about teams and units. They can do that, a high functioning one at least. But I think what really becomes a struggle is, again, sort of stateside or outside the base, where, okay, I've committed myself to living a certain way. I've stated outright, or people have stated for me, that I'm defending XYZ values. Now, where do I look to find that? I think it's a hard thing to find outside of the military. And that is why you have so much mental health stuff going on. Because the world does not resemble the idealized one that you can, write out in a mission statement or list out, values for. It just doesn't. Um, I think this is sort of Sebastian Junger's thesis, by the way, in his book Tribe, but
Yep.
um, I think it's absolutely true. You know, it's very difficult for soldiers, whomever, to come home or get out of the army and function in a world that does not value, that's, maybe they say they do, but you know, in practice does not value the same things that they do or they did.
It doesn't look the same. Like you've lost that
Yeah.
sense. I love that book. It was given to me by a veteran, actually, and it's such an important point about how important it is for people to have that community, have that tribe around them. And I think that once you leave the military, you really lose that feeling from under your feet. And I agree. I think that is a huge source of mental health concerns for
Yeah.
veterans.
And I think, I mean, again, to, you know, circle back to the art of it all. I think, because I think sometimes it's difficult to know the source of your own struggle until you've really examined it. And therapy, whatever, you know, I don't say whatever to minimize that. I mean that there are different avenues to explore that. For me, the art has been invaluable in doing that, in understanding why I get frustrated, you know, at certain times, or whatever the case. And I think, again, everybody should take a time to give energy to that, to exploring art in whatever capacity, even if it's consuming art. I think there's huge value in that, because, you know, there's so much truth, you know, capital T truth, to be found in books and museums, and you know, it's just not something that typically the military puts a focus on. But I think it can be hugely, hugely beneficial.
I agree. I mean, I think you're talking to something that's so basic and fundamental, which is just that veterans really, at the end of the day, regardless of how they get there, need to feel seen and heard, right?
Definitely.
And like art is just such a huge part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's stuff like this too. It's nice to just be able to dump this stuff, you know,
Yeah.
and yeah.
You know, and first off, I just want to thank you, Bobby, for coming on the show, and I really appreciate it. I'm glad we're finally able to wrap up. And we usually let our guests, you know, if you want to wrap up, say anything for your writings, please do so. But really a pleasure having you on there. And I just echo what Bobby has to say about writing. I mean, I hear this a lot from people, and they're like, I'm not a very good writer. And I'm like, why don't you let me be the judge of that? Because I think there's and for a lot of people that, you know, they have that voice inside of them. They want to say things, but there's also that other voice inside of them saying, no, don't do it. Don't say all those things. People won't like it. And I just say to that, go and write it. And it is the best thing that I have done transitioning out of the military, is just write every day, no matter what. And it's, you know, exercise, good for you as well. Writing is cathartic, and also a poor man's psychologist as well. Okay, you got anything to wrap it up on?
No, I thank you, Bobby, for coming on and sharing, because I think you took a little bit of a different perspective than a lot of our guests. And I just really liked hearing about like what happens to somebody when they're 6 and they have a really specific dream and then they get to live it. So just thank you for sharing that. I felt encouraged.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. This has been fun and helpful. And yeah, I mean, I think, can I curse on here?
Absolutely.
Fuck yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's important to remember, you know, Will, to your point, right? Like some people do get embarrassed about it because it is bearing your soul in a lot of ways to create anything. But some of the baddest motherfuckers I know, you know, have written poetry, or they draw, or they've, you know, tried their hand at fiction. And, or, you know, or they do something as simple as keep a journal. And again, I think there's huge value in it. Everybody should do it, especially if you've got stuff that you're reckoning with, that you're trying to you know, to help sit easier and smoother inside you. There's huge value in that. So I would encourage everybody to do it. Find somebody you trust, somebody smart and kind who can, give you, if you want feedback, who can tell you where the nuggets of gold are and all the shit that will inevitably be on the page when you start
That's
out doing
exactly
this.
right.
Yep, because you're going to be bad, but it doesn't mean that you won't get better, and doesn't mean there won't be value in it from the first sentence you write. So, robertbminer.com if you guys want to check out my stuff. And this has been amazing. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bobby. And I'll see you at the gym. Try not to show me up anymore, man. All right. So thanks for joining us and offering our guests a place to heal loudly. We'll see you next time.